This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive in today. We're going back in time, back to the years leading up to World War II. This period between the wars. It's always fascinated me.
Oh, absolutely. It's a time of such dramatic shifts, globally and for the U.S.
Exactly, and we're going to unpack that, focusing on the U.S. and this whole idea of isolationism. We're taking a deep dive into this history podcast. It's called, To What Extent Did the U.S. Pursue an Isolationist Policy Before 1933? So was the U.S. really as isolationist as we often think?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, we hear that term thrown around a lot.
Right, like they just shut themselves off from the world and said, see you later. But I mean, think about it. The U.S. had just come out of World War I. It was brutal.
Oh, devastating. Millions dead, a whole generation scarred by the trenches.
Exactly. So is it any wonder they wanted to pull back from global affairs?
Not at all. Imagine the feeling back then. They'd been drawn into this European conflict, this war that felt so far removed from their own lives, and the cost was just enormous.
Yeah. And then you've got the U.S. rejecting the Treaty of Versailles, refusing to join the League of Nations.
Huge signals, right?
Totally. Like they were saying, we're done with Europe's drama, we're staying out of it.
And that's where you see this school of thought emerge, the traditionalist school, I think they call it.
Oh, interesting. What's their take?
Well, they argue that this push for isolationism, it wasn't just about avoiding another war. It was rooted in this whole idea of American exceptionalism.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but remind me.
Basically, this belief that the U.S. is different, unique, a shining city on a hill,
A beacon of democracy in a world full of, well, not democracies.
Exactly. They felt like they were above the messy, complicated world of global politics.
So they thought they could just sort of float above it all.
Kind of, yeah. And then you add in the economic boom of the 1920s, the Roaring '20s.
Yeah.
America's experiencing this incredible prosperity, right? And they're thinking, why mess with a good thing? Why risk it all by getting tangled up in foreign conflicts?
It makes sense from their perspective. But here's the thing that I always find so interesting. Even during this so-called period of isolationism, the U.S. wasn't completely hands-off.
Right. There's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
It's like they were engaged, but in a very calculated, very strategic way. Like, take the Washington Naval Conference in 1921, 1922.
A big one. A major international conference.
Yeah.
And the U.S. was the host. Britain, Japan, all the big players were there.
And the goal?
Limiting naval armaments, trying to prevent another arms race, the kind that helped lead to World War I.
So they're not just sitting on the sidelines. They're actively trying to shape things.
Yeah. And they weren't just hosting it, they were actively pushing for those limitations. Yeah. The U.S. was a major force in those negotiations.
So it's more like, we might not want to fight, but we're sure going to try to prevent a situation where we have to fight.
Exactly. And then you have the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928.
Yeah.
Almost every nation in the world signed on to this treaty.
Okay, I don't know this one. What was it?
It was a pact to, get this, outlaw war.
Really? Outlaw war. That's ambitious.
Oh, incredibly ambitious.
Yeah.
Of course, it didn't actually prevent World War II, but it does show you something really interesting about U.S. foreign policy at the time.
What's that?
Even while advocating for isolationism, they were still trying to shape the world, They wanted to influence the global stage in a way that protected their interests and, ideally, promoted peace.
So it's not as black and white as we often think, this whole isolationism thing.
Not at all. There's so many nuances.
It's like they were trying to find this balance, right? Between staying out of conflicts and still shaping the world around them.
A tightrope walk, for sure. And then, of course, you have the rise of another school of historical thought, the consensus school. They focus on a different aspect of this whole story.
Oh, tell me more. I always like hearing different interpretations of history.
Well, the consensus school, they put the spotlight on Franklin D. Roosevelt. He comes into office in 1932. Right? Smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression.
Talk about a rough time to become president.
No kidding. So understandably, his main focus is on domestic issues, getting the country back on its feet.
Of course, got to fix the home front first. But at the same time, things are getting really dicey in Europe and Asia, the rise of fascist regimes.
Exactly. And that's where the consensus school comes in. Historians like William Leuchtenberg, they argue that Roosevelt, despite all the pressure to stay isolationist, He sees the writing on the wall.
He sees the threat these regimes pose.
You got it. And he starts, very subtly, preparing the U.S. for a larger role on the world stage.
So he's got this balancing act, right?
Oh, a huge one. He's got to navigate public opinion, which is still largely isolationist, while also getting the country ready for potential conflict that he sees brewing.
A tough spot to be in for sure. And we start to see some early signs of that shift in thinking with Roosevelt's quarantine speech in 1937.
Oh, that's a key moment. Now, it's not a declaration of war or anything, but it's definitely a signal that things are changing. He actually suggests that aggressor nations, like Nazi Germany, should be quarantined by the international community.
Whoa. That's some pretty strong language.
It is, like comparing them to a disease, you know.
And it's a sign that he's realizing that isolationism might not be enough to protect U.S. interests, or world peace for that matter.
Right. It's a wake-up call. Things are starting to feel much more urgent. It's like the storm clouds are gathering, and the U.S. is starting to realize that they can't just stay on the sidelines anymore. What happens in Europe and Asia, it's going to affect them, whether they like it or not.
Right.
You know, things get even more complicated when we look at what's happening in Asia at the same time. Like, while all this is going on in Europe, there's another big story unfolding.
Right, Japan. We can't forget about Japan's growing ambitions in the Pacific.
Exactly. And it really starts to ramp up with their invasion of Manchuria in 1931.
A huge chunk of territory in northeastern China.
Yeah.
Just took it.
It was a bold move.
Yeah.
And a shock to the international community. I mean, it was a clear violation of international law, and it showed that Japan was willing to use force to get what it wanted, expand its empire, you know?
So even with all this talk of isolationism, the U.S. couldn't just ignore this, right?
No, not at all. They respond with what becomes known as the Stimson Doctrine, named after, well, Henry Stimson. He was the Secretary of State at the time.
Okay, so what did this doctrine say?
Essentially, it was a statement of non-recognition. They said the U.S. wouldn't recognize any territory taken by force.
So it was a way of condemning Japan's actions, but without actually doing anything about it?
Yeah, pretty much. It was a diplomatic slap on the wrist. You know, the U.S. was still really hesitant to get directly involved in a conflict, especially in Asia.
They wanted to uphold international law and all that, but
without risking getting dragged into another war, they were walking a fine line, you know.
And did it work? I mean, did Japan just back down and say, oh, okay, you got us, we'll pack up and go home now?
Not quite. If anything, I think their actions in Manchuria kind of emboldened them.
Right.
They just kept pushing their luck throughout the 1930s. And this is where things get really interesting, because you have this other group of historians, the Revisionists, and they come in with a whole different take on U.S. foreign policy.
Oh, yeah. I've heard a little about them. They're a bit more critical, right?
Yeah, they definitely offer a more, let's say, skeptical perspective.
Yeah.
They suggest that Roosevelt might have been playing a deeper game. Some revisionists even argue that maybe, just maybe, some of his actions were designed to provoke Japan.
Whoa, hold on. Provoke. Like he wanted a war with them.
Well, I don't think anyone's saying he was intentionally trying to start a war. But some revisionists argue that he might have recognized that war was becoming inevitable. He might have been using certain policies like economic sanctions to kind of push Japan into a corner, you know, knowing it could lead to conflict.
Oh, I see. Like a calculated risk, maybe?
Yeah. And the thinking is, if there was a conflict, it would be much easier to rally public support for war.
Okay, so it's a complicated picture. And it definitely adds a new layer to how we think about U.S. actions in the Pacific. So Japan's out there expanding its empire. What does the U.S. do next? Do they just stick with the Stimson Doctrine and cross their fingers?
At first, yeah, pretty much. They keep up the diplomatic pressure, but they're still trying to avoid direct involvement. But as Japan gets more and more aggressive, you know, especially with the full-scale invasion of China in 1937, the U.S. starts to realize they can't just sit back and watch.
And that leads to the oil embargo in 1940, right? That was a big one.
Huge. I mean, Japan was heavily reliant on oil imports from the U.S., and this embargo really put the squeeze on them, economically speaking. It's a major turning point. I mean, a lot of historians argue that it was one of the main things that pushed Japan to attack Pearl Harbor.
Because they felt like they had no other choice. Like they had to secure their own sources of oil no matter what.
Exactly. Japan's leaders, particularly their prime minister at the time, Hideki Tojo, they believed they could knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet with the surprise attack. They thought that would give them free rein in Southeast Asia, you know, where there are all those vital resources.
And of course, we know how that gamble turned out.
It backfired. Big time. They thought it would force the U.S. to back down, but it did the exact opposite. The attack on Pearl Harbor completely unified American public opinion. It brought the whole country together, and that's what ultimately brought the U.S. into World War II.
Wow. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? They spent decades trying to avoid another war, and then, bam! It's an attack on their own soil that finally pulls them in.
It's a reminder that sometimes, even the best laid plans
don't always work out the way you expect.
Exactly. The U.S. might have started the 1930s wanting to stay isolated, but events just spiraled in a way that made that impossible. And Pearl Harbor really became the bridge between that desire for isolation and the realities of a world on the brink of war.
So much happened. We've gone from the aftermath of World War I to the brink of another world war. And I think it all really comes to a head, comes crashing down with the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Definitely a turning point in history. And
Yeah.
December 7th, 1941, that date's just seared into American memory,
Yeah.
The images, the stories. It's
hard to even imagine, isn't it?
It is. It was just so audacious, so shocking.
And it wasn't just a military attack. It was like a psychological blow to the nation, right?
Absolutely. It shattered this whole idea that the U.S. could just stay safe, isolated, while the rest of the world was falling apart. Like, that illusion was gone.
Like reality just smacked them in the face.
Yeah.
So what happens next? I mean, how does the U.S. respond to this?
The response was immediate. It was powerful. I mean, the very next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt addresses Congress.
Ah, yes, the day of infamy speech.
Exactly. One of the most famous speeches in American history. He doesn't hold back, He calls it a date which will live in infamy and asks Congress to declare war on Japan.
And that's just the beginning, right?
Right. I mean, a few days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, they declare war on the U.S. So suddenly, America's at war on multiple fronts.
So you have this nation that was like so divided about getting involved in another war, and suddenly, bam, they're all in, unified.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just like a political unity, it was this societal shift. People from all walks of life, they're volunteering for military service. Industries are switching over to war production. The whole country mobilizes.
Wow. And I think what's really striking, it wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about something bigger,
Yeah, there was this sense of purpose that really emerged from the ashes of Pearl Harbor. This feeling that they were fighting for something truly important. Democracy, freedom, a world free from tyranny.
It's like Pearl Harbor, as horrible as it was, it clarified things for the U.S., it clarified their role in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The era of isolationism was over. What took its place was this idea of America as a global leader, a defender of democracy, a force for peace and stability.
And it's fascinating, right? This shift, it comes out of tragedy, but it also reflects this growing recognition that the world's just interconnected, that actions have consequences, and that the U.S., as a major power, has certain responsibilities.
Absolutely. The world was changing, and America couldn't just sit back and watch anymore. They had to engage, and they had to lead.
So what a journey, right? From wanting to stay out of it all to being right in the thick of it. It's a long and complicated path, this whole idea of U.S. isolationism.
It really is. Full of twists and turns. They wanted peace, but they were willing to fight when they had to.
It makes you think, it makes you think about how complicated foreign policy really is. How do you balance your ideals with the realities of the world?
It's a tough question.
Right. Yeah.
And it's one that we're still grappling with today, I think.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the aftermath of one war to the eve of another, it's a reminder that history is never simple, that foreign policy is this constant balancing act, and that the decisions made by leaders, they really do have lasting consequences.
Yeah. It's a story full of complexities, full of contradictions, and I think it just invites us to keep exploring, to keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper into the forces that shape the world we live in.
Absolutely. And that's what we encourage all of you to do, too. Dive into those sources, explore different perspectives, and draw your own conclusions. Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive into U.S. isolationism and the road to World War II.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.